Hello, welcome to week 7. We are starting to skip around now in our chapters, and this week we will cover chapter 14, which is complying with state and federal laws. The reason we're taking this chapter before some of the others is because some of the assignments you will have pertaining to marketing and some other things will involve advertising, and you will need to know some of this information to prepare your advertisements and do your assignments. Also, it's so important that we're going to want to touch on it a little bit from here on out in different aspects and reinforce some things, because if you plan to do any kind of property management, whether for yourself or as a business or as an employee, you really need to understand some of these issues because you can get into some serious trouble. The feds don't mess around with the fair housing laws or the ADA, the Americans with Disabilities Act. And I'm personally aware of some folks that have gotten into some hefty fine situations by making sort of innocuous statements or mistakes even that they were unaware were violations of the law. So we want to make sure that doesn't happen to you. And we're going to give you some resources also that you will know where to ask for help and go if you have any questions. There are a number of federal laws that apply to any kind of business activity, and one of those is the antitrust laws. The Sherman antitrust law is one that's the most commonly known, and that means that you cannot collaborate with other people in your same business to fix prices. If you sit down with the other property managers in your community and you say, I think we should all charge 8% management fees, and you decide that's what you're doing, that's illegal. The same thing with determining up the price of rent. If you call around to all your competitors and say, what do you get for a studio apartment near the college? And if they tell you, no, I charge $650, $750, well, if we all charge $800, we'll all make really good money. That's a violation of the antitrust laws. So you always want to be really careful when you're talking to any of your competitors about your rental rates or the amount you charge for your management fees, because someone could perceive that as price fixing or colluding with those people to set prices. It's the same principle if you say, I'll take all the area west of the highway and you take all the area east of the highway, and then we can kind of, corner the market. That's not allowed either. So kind of those things that are kind of shady, they're actually illegal in a lot of cases. Another issue that comes up pretty often is Megan's Law, which is pertaining to folks who are on the sex offender registry. Now, Idaho is very minimal in the laws it has about disclosing that. In the real estate law, for example, you are not required to disclose to anyone whether there's been a murder committed on the property or if a sex offender lives in the neighborhood, because you're supposed to talk about the property, not about the neighbors or the neighborhood. That's another tip that will keep you out of hot water. Whenever you're describing your advertising, you always want to describe the property. You're very safe if you do that and not the actual neighborhood. But there are no requirements that I'm aware of that you must disclose to someone that there's a sex offender in the building or in the neighborhood. Now, if they specifically ask, you can't lie if you know. We always tell our real estate licensees, if someone asks about that, you should direct them to law enforcement to check into it, because you don't have the information. And of course, you don't have all the information. So it's always best to go to the actual expert resource in that regard. Another thing that is not actually necessarily in the law, but it has to do with disclosing things that you know or reasonably should have known are wrong with the property or defective. If you know, for example, that the roof leaks and you don't disclose that to somebody and they move in and their items are damaged, that is something that you would be liable for. We get a number of these cases in the real estate area for sales of houses where people know things. For example, we had one where the lady selling the property knew that there was a big assessment coming from the HOA to replace the roof. It was about $1,400, I think. And she didn't bother telling the people who were looking at her townhouse to buy it that there was going to be this assessment coming. And right after the closing, sure enough, here comes the bill for $1,400. And those people were ticked, as you can well imagine. They probably still would have bought the property if they had been told, but at least then they would have been able to make some plans. And that's why it's important that you're always straightforward with people. Now, you're not required to guess. And if you don't know for sure, you're not required to say anything. But it's always a good practice, if you definitely know of something, to say it. And if you are not sure and somebody's asking, then you also can point them in a good place, whether it's a city, a county, get a home inspection, whatever that might be. Not so much for rentals, the inspection part of things, but it's always best to refer people to other experts or sources of information, because you are not the expert on all these things, right? Any property that was built before 1978 is deemed to be target property for the purposes of lead paint. So if you're looking at an older property to purchase or manage, and it was built before 1978, you will want to find out about the lead paint disclosure laws. There are significant requirements in federal law about that, and also about who can abate and remediate lead paint in buildings. You have to have a special certificate and training to be able to do that now. And that's something else that you should be aware of. So remember 1978, FYI, that was a time period when there was aluminum wiring in some properties too. So it's another thing to check on that, because aluminum wiring is not necessarily a good thing. Now, when you're looking for tenants, a lot of times you're going to run their credit. There's a Fair Credit Reporting Act, and so you'll need to be up to speed on what that law requires, what you can and can't ask for, and what you can and can't say, and what you can or can't do with that information, because we all know that you're going to want to know if that person can pay the rent. So it's important for you to be able to be conversant in that law. There's one I learned about in this chapter that I was not even aware of, that there is a specially designated persons list, blocked person, and you're not allowed to conduct any business with any of these people. There's apparently a list on a website, and you are supposed to, it's the Treasury Department, and you are supposed to run all your names against this list and make sure you're not renting a property to someone whose name is on the list, because sometimes naughty people use business transactions and rentals and things in the United States and purchasing property to launder money or their ill-gotten gains from drug cartels and that kind of thing. And so I learned, and I didn't know, that you are supposed to check that list. So that's a good thing too. One thing you're not allowed to ask is if somebody's a citizen, believe it or not. I believe you might be able to ask if they have legal presence in the United States. Who knows if that's even allowed? We're allowed to ask in order to get a real estate license, but I'm not entirely sure what the law is about that. Because there are a lot of people who aren't citizens, but they are legally present in the United States for one reason or another. So I do believe that is a reasonable inquiry. Now we're going to get into Anti-Discrimination, Fair Housing, and Americans with Disabilities Act. And these are so major and so mammoth that really I don't have the expertise to get down in the weeds about a lot of these details, but I can tell you where you need to look. And the Fair Housing Act is probably one of the things that I would caution you about the most. The Fair Housing Act is administered by the Department of Housing and Urban Development, or HUD, and HUD.gov is a website where there are some resources where you can read more information about this. I'm also posting a PowerPoint that was prepared by the Seattle office of HUD. I'm trying to find out if they have a recorded video of their webinar on fair housing training, because I think it'd be very worthwhile for you to watch if you're considering doing property management. Remember, this is a federal law, so it would apply no matter what state you're in. But there are a number of agencies in the United States. In the larger states, it's typically a government agency, but in the smaller states, quite often it's a private nonprofit that's obtained what they call a grant to administer the fair housing laws. And what these agencies do is they hire testers to pretend to be potential tenants, and they will call or come by the rental office and tell you they want to rent a property or ask about a property if it's available. And if they feel like they've been discriminated against in any way, they will go back and report back to this agency, and the agency will most likely file a complaint about alleged discrimination. At that point, the burden's on you to prove you didn't discriminate. I will tell you, in Idaho especially, there is an outfit called the Intermountain Fair Housing Council. It is a nonprofit that receives grants to administer and enforce the fair housing laws in Idaho. I don't think they're your friend. I think that it's very difficult because I think they mean well and they would like to give you information, but many times when you call and ask them for information, sometimes that kind of puts a target on your back. And I know a number of people who've had very difficult experiences with them, and it seems to me like they kind of might overreach a little bit in trying to pursue violations. We actually had them come and speak at one of our real estate trainings a couple of years ago, and somebody asked the question, if I ask somebody, are you a tester, do you have to tell me? And the man said, no, we're not obligated to tell you that. So you kind of have to assume everybody's a tester, anybody who calls to inquire about a property for rent, and make sure that you have a script and that you have procedures and that you are doing everything in accordance with the law, that you can document this is how you always do it. Especially if you have employees, it's very important, because when you're not the one who's actually doing it and you're trusting others who, as we will remember, are your agents for the purposes of you being responsible for them, if they mess up or even make a mistake, or say something that sounds kind of innocuous, you're responsible for them. And this is why it's a good idea to have a script. Anytime anybody calls, I'll tell you a real common thing they'll ask about is pets and service animals. The fair housing law requires that you have to allow a service animal or a companion animal, and you can't ask very much about why. People are allowed to modify your dwellings for their animals. They are allowed to have them, and basically you have to let them do whatever in that building. You can try and collect damages afterwards. They are responsible for paying for any damages, but you have to assume they're probably not going to have the money. You can't get any extra security deposit. Miniature horses now can be considered service animals. So, welcome to the world of property management. I will tell you that this is probably an area that I think needs to be reined in a little bit, because anyone can attest whether this animal is a service animal. It doesn't have to be a healthcare professional. It could be your mom, be your sister. Yeah, I know her. She gets stressed out at night when she has to sleep alone, so she has 5 pit bulls, and those are her companion animals, and then you basically have to let the person have 5 pit bulls. Sorry to say, you can't exclude any animals on the basis of general breeds. No, you can't say, I'm not taking any Rottweilers. Absolutely not. You have to know this particular Rottweiler is a bad dog, and then you can exclude it. But it's very tricky. I don't want to sound too negative about this, but I will just tell you there are many traps for the unwary. Now, the good news is there are some exemptions in this law. If you are managing your own single-family houses and you don't use a property manager or a broker or anyone else to do that, you manage them all yourself, and they're single-family dwellings, you don't have to allow, 5 pit bulls or a miniature horse or some of these other things. But you still have to be very careful in your advertising, because you're still liable for your advertising in that case. The other exception is if you have a dwelling with up to 3 or 4, I'm not sure which it is, but you actually live in it. So if you have a 4-plex and you live in one of the units, I believe that you're also exempt from that requirement. But if you have more than that, then it applies to you even if you live in it. So if you live in an 8-plex, you still have to allow all these things. You cannot try to steer particular kinds of people toward units. You can't say, somebody comes to you and says, I have 8 children and I want to rent this 2-bedroom apartment. You are not allowed to say, I don't think you'll fit. I don't know where you'll put 8 children. There's not room for 8 children. It's a 600 square foot apartment. You have to consider them as an applicant the same way you would consider anyone else, and you cannot exclude them for that reason. I'm telling you this only so that you are aware that really the only people you can keep out and away from renting to is a current known drug user. That's about it. And so there's just any number of disabilities and things where people are in a protected class, and so you have to be very aware. The Americans with Disabilities Act also comes into play here because if you are building a new building, you have to meet ADA accessibility requirements. And even in some cases, you have to make your units ADA accessible. You may have to make some modifications or do some things to your properties to make them accessible. That's another area of the law that you will see testers coming around and checking, especially with new construction, not so much with existing older dwelling units, but something to be aware of, because if somebody says, you know, I'd really like to rent this apartment, but I need you to widen this doorway, or I need you to lower the towel rack, or do something else, you kind of need to do it. So just keep that in mind. If you're looking at a property to acquire, you want to factor that into the cost of any functional obsolescence or any updates you might need to make to the property to make it rentable, because that's something else that will also come into play. Now that I've frightened you half to death, I just want to tell you that at the end of the day, it's manageable. So as Steve Fender was saying in his interview, that, you know, make sure you have processes and procedures well documented, and you train your employees if you have them, and you have a script. So when someone answers the phone, everybody is saying the same thing every time, and you have a good defense then when somebody comes around and says, well, you said this and that. No, I didn't. I said this, and this is exactly what we always say, and here's my script. Now, if you'd ever have employees, you also need to know about wage and hour laws, and how long somebody can work without having to have a break, or working more than 40 hours requires them to be paid overtime, what's minimum wage. There are going to be some exceptions for that too if you provide housing as part of someone's compensation. So if you have a large apartment property, for example, and you have a live-in manager, there are going to be some exceptions to that minimum wage, and those are things that are beyond the scope of this course, so you'll probably want to check with an accountant on that. And finally, last but not least, you will want to know about zoning and land use laws. Especially if you're looking at buying a property to place under management and you're not sure if it's, a lot of times you'll see houses that are used for offices, for example. Maybe somebody was allowed to do that under a conditional use, and maybe the property is not zoned for office. So if you want to make some improvements or buy the property and use it, you might want to check on that before you do that, because it might be grandfathered for the current owner, but anybody new coming in might have to meet the current zoning. Or if you want to add on to the property or so forth, you might have to meet the current zoning. So those are good things to check on. You want to check with your local zoning authority whenever you're interested in buying a property, and make sure that the zoning is right for the use of the property that is there today, so that if you ever want to expand or remodel or do something, that you're not going to get stuck in a bad spot being unable to do that. And of course you have to meet all the building codes and electrical codes and plumbing and all that, and that's a good idea anyway, because they're there for a reason, and that's to make sure that your house doesn't burn down or flood or something that it's not supposed to do. That's about all I have for you this time. I'm going to post a PowerPoint, as I said, from the HUD office, and I really hope that you'll take a look at it. I am going to try to see if I can come up with a video of their webinar that they offer. They're having one coming up in April, but it's limited in the participants and it's closed. I'm going to see if I can get in and maybe videotape it myself so I can put it up for you. The laws do change pretty often, and I'm sure that's kind of why they're reluctant to make a recording, because they don't want it to be obsolete and have somebody rely on it. But if you go to HUD.gov, you can get a lot of information about the ADA and fair housing. And if you're going to have employees, you'll want to talk to an accountant. And you might also want to do some consultation with an HR professional if you're going to have a number of employees, because it doesn't matter so much if you only have a couple, but if you start getting into a bigger organization, then you've got the Affordable Care Act, you've got family medical leave that might apply, and some other things. So we're going to talk a little bit about the advertising requirements when we get into our next assignment. So part of the reason that, as I said, that I wanted to cover this chapter now is because I want you to be aware of the things you can and can't say in an ad. I'm going to also post a list of words and phrases that should not be used in advertising. And again, you want to always describe the property as much as you can and not the neighborhood or the neighbors. With that, I will close for this time and wish you all an excellent week. Thank you again.